This is the first ROG Strix branded laptop from 2016, and nearly 10 years later, we're gonna see if ASUS's original gaming powerhouse still has any fight left in it. Hey everyone, Retro Tech Dad here, and I'm back this week with another interesting find from the land of eBay. And this is going to be similar to a video I did on the 10-year-old Razer Blade 14 from a few months ago. So let's quickly get this package opened up, and the seller used an egg carton on the top, which is actually pretty clever and hilarious for packaging purposes. So what I've got here is clearly laptop shaped, and yes, it's another 10-year-old laptop, but this time around we're going to check out what you could get from ASUS, and specifically from the ROG Strix lineup. The listing did include a 120 watt power adapter, but I do know that some of these models shipped with a 180 watt model, and speaking of that, this is their GL502 VT-DS71 model, and I paid a whopping $135 for it secondhand. And these went for a decent chunk of money, starting anywhere from $1,250 to $1,400, and of course, depending on the configuration back then, you could easily drive up that price to well over $1,600. This is actually the first ROG Strix branded laptop ever made by ASUS, which is going to be kind of cool to check out. And I'm sure just like the Razer Blade video I did, I'll get comments telling me just how trash ASUS laptops are. And I think given that this is a 10-year-old laptop, I don't have any specific allegiance to any brand, so by all means feel free to share your experiences, both good and bad, in the comments section. So what did the first Strix laptop get you back in 2016? And my specific model is somewhere in between the various configurations that ASUS offered. And so what I've got here is a laptop that was definitely very powerful for its time with an Intel i7 6700HQ, a Geforce GTX 970M with 3GB of dedicated VRAM, 16GB of DDR4 RAM, a 128GB SSD, and a 15.6-inch anti-glare IPS display with a resolution of 1920 by 1080, and yet again, better than that HP laptop from Walmart that is being sold in 2026 with a 1366 by 768 resolution. I actually really like the design of this Strix laptop. It's got a brushed aluminum lid with the ROG logo on it that looks very clean overall, with a fully backlit keyboard illuminated in orange that is really nice to type on and use, with tastefully done accents for the lettering, and then the WASD as well. The trackpad is surprisingly quite good for a 2016 laptop. I do like that it's not over the top with its design, and if anything, probably seems fairly tame many years later when looking back on how wild these gaming laptop designs can look. This unit came with a nice port selection, including 3 USB-A 3.0 ports, a USB-C 3.1 port, an SD card reader, Gigabit Ethernet port, a 3.5mm audio combo jack, and even an HDMI out and mini display port, and of course stereo speakers that were built in on each side in the palm rest area, which are just okay in terms of sound quality. So this unit is definitely a bit beat up, and we'll need some TLC to get it cleaned up and looking a lot better than it does right now. It's got some worn out stickers that need to be removed, and just overall can use a thorough wipe down, and outside of it looking a bit nasty, the listing did mention that the battery is dead and will need a new one. So let's quickly check that out, and then I'll go ahead and grab the power adapter and then power this on for the first time to take a look at what's going on here. And what do you know, we've got signs of life, and it does look like this was set up with a generic local account, and yes, of course, we've got everyone's favorite operating system, Windows 11, installed here, and you probably noticed the flickering of the panel. And I did read about this being an issue with these older Strix laptops that suffered from PWM flickering with their displays, and so unfortunately, this is not your laptop if you suffer from sensitivities to this, but at the max brightness, which mind you is not super bright, topping out at under 300 nits, it does resolve the flickering issue. So everything looks fine to me here. What's interesting is that the unit does stay powered on when I unplug the laptop from the power adapter. But I did notice some weird things happening, and even when I tried to generate a battery report, Windows just didn't know what to do with that. Regardless, this is a 10-year-old unit, which I assume still has its original battery in it, and so yes, I am prepared to buy a new battery just because why not? And even on Amazon, they are fairly inexpensive and readily available. Alright, let's go ahead and give this a good wipe down and then go under the hood and check out what is in fact going on with this unit to learn more about it. So as I said, this laptop is pretty filthy, and we'll probably need a couple of pass-throughs to get this cleaned up properly, but nothing some wipes and a little patience can't fix. The lid is probably in the best shape out of everything here, since the brushed aluminum seems to be fairly durable and has withstood years of abuse. On the bottom, the story is a bit different, and the rubber feet have certainly seen better days, and these just have all kinds of dirt caked in there, but I'm happy that they are still fully intact since these are super cool in that neon orange color, and again just goes back to those subtle accents that I mentioned earlier. I had to really work these wipes in, and the dirt is definitely caked on there, but the good news is that it's coming off with just the wipes. I did use some tweezers that I had in my iFixit kit, which will let me get into some grooves here, and what I like to do is put the wipe under the tweezer and then clean as you go. You can see just how much gunk I was able to get out by doing this. Okay, with the feet looking a lot better, it's time to wipe down the plastic on the bottom. And I imagine based on everything we've seen that these wipes are going to be pretty filthy when I'm done. And with that, it's now time to remove this very worn out and pretty gross looking sticker that clearly just needs to be cleaned off. And what I will do here is just get as much of the sticker off as possible and leave the rest to the amazing power of Goo Gone. I was able to get a good part off just by carefully lifting it up, but I decided to grab a spudger from the iFixit kit and gently scrape off the rest. Again, I'm not too worried about sticker residue since the Goo Gone will take care of all that. Thankfully, the large white sticker in the middle was super simple to remove, but it does have some leftover residue, and so now with those stickers off, let's go ahead and grab some Goo Gone and take care of this mess. I recommend that everyone keep a bottle of Goo Gone on hand as it works great for a lot of different purposes, but best of all, you don't need a lot of this stuff for it to work really well, and so I just dabbed on a small amount for both of those spots and then let it sit a bit and wipe it all away. There's a reason why I've had this bottle for years. Anyways, we've got those spots cleaned off, and this is just a first pass, but it already looks better than it did before. But I do want to now check out under the hood and see how bad things look in there, since I imagine there will be a cleaning process given how the exterior looked. I do appreciate that this is a super simple laptop to get into, and there are 10 screws in total holding the bottom plate in place, and with just a pick I'm able to pop the bottom cover off and then remove the rest by hand. And as expected, this is pretty nasty looking with lots of dust caked on here. The same goes for the actual internal components, which we now have a good look at, and it's a pretty typical setup here for a gaming laptop with the fairly substantial heatsink and dual fans. The exhaust portion has some orange spray paint, which is only just a subtle accent when the bottom plate is on. We've got a single stick of 8GB of DDR4 RAM, and you might be wondering, wait, doesn't this have 16GB? And you would be correct, but the other 8GB is actually soldered to the board, and so while it's nice that I could upgrade this if I wanted to, I do wish we had 2 slots instead, but hey, it's better than nothing. You'll notice that we also have an empty M.2 slot that can accommodate a 2280 form factor drive, and so I will be adding a 512GB drive that I have lying around. In fact, it's the same one I used from a prior video, and it's just one that I use for projects like this. But this laptop did come with a 128GB 2.5-inch SSD drive that is populated here in the bottom left. I do like that we not only have the ability to change out the storage, but we have some flexibility here with the 2 options. The battery doesn't show any obvious signs of failure, but as I said before, I will be replacing it just because it's a 10-year-old battery that does look to be original with the laptop, and this will give me an opportunity to jot down the model number and then go onto Amazon so I can make an order for a new one. While I'm in the process of removing things from this laptop, I'm going to go ahead and remove the fans, since these definitely need a good cleaning. The same goes for the heatsink here, as I imagine the thermal compound is probably dried out by now and could use a good refresh, and I think I'll replace any thermal pads that I find here as well. And with some screws removed, the heatsink pops on out, and it does in fact look like this stuff is very dried out, and there are a few pads here as well. So it's been 2 days.
2 days later.
And of course, Amazon has delivered a new battery, and during the downtime I decided to start a new 3D print of Forky here from Toy Story. I actually saw Toy Story 5 a few days ago with my family and felt inspired to make a print of him. I can very much relate to the whole idea of bringing some of those forgotten pieces of tech back to life, much like I'm doing here. It's a good reminder to give some of your older pieces of tech some love and attention. Anyways, before I installed the new battery, I wanted to give this laptop the full cleaning experience, and there was a lot to wipe down. I used a combination of isopropyl alcohol, Q-tips, wipes, brushes, you name it. This one was definitely a bigger cleanup process than that Razer laptop from a few weeks ago. I removed all the old thermal compound from the CPU and GPU, and they cleaned off nicely since most of it was so dry it just came right off. I did the same thing to the heatsink, which likewise had its own dried out thermal compound stuck to it, but nothing that a little bit of isopropyl alcohol and some Q-tips certainly can't fix or clean up. There was definitely a lot of dust present here as well, and plenty of areas where the dust built up into the exhaust grills and even just on parts of the heatsink itself, including the thermal pads, which I will be replacing. So now that everything was dusted off, wiped down, and cleaned up a bit, I wanted to give it another go through, and so I headed outside, and it's been a while since we've had a good blowjob. but this laptop could definitely use the extra love. You know what that means? Time for a nice soothing time lapse. Alright, I'm back inside and I'm safe from the sun that's seemingly trying to kill me like the one in Super Mario Bros. 3. So it's now time to do some measuring and cutting since I have this sheet of Arctic TP4 to replace the old thermal pads here, and I think this stuff should be a nice improvement over what's existing, and mostly because they could use new pads since they're covered in dust and dirt. It's definitely a little bit of a time-consuming process, but I think it's worth it, and there were only 6 pads to replace here of various sizes, and so I just grabbed them one at a time and used them as sort of a guideline for how much I need to cut and replace. Also, in between, I did check the thickness of the pads with some calipers just to double check that they are in fact the same as the sheet I have here, which is 0.5 millimeters, and the pads here are all the same thickness, so it was a pretty simple replacement. Thanks to the power of editing, we can fly through this section and get all the new pads on here and then move on to the next part of this project, which is to replace the gunky foam that's on the old fans. I opted to keep the old fans since I didn't want to put too much money into this project for obvious reasons, and yes, you can actually buy replacement fans out there, but these were still working, so instead, I just took the time to clean them out nicely, and the foam strips that were on here were very worn from age. And so I'm just going to go ahead and remove them and replace them with some foam that I have here on hand. At first, I was scraping off the nasty foam, but I realized it was stuck to a piece of adhesive, so I was able to just pull it off by carefully lifting the adhesive strip off the fan. And so with that, I hit it with a little more isopropyl alcohol and then just one last wipe down, and these look much cleaner and nicer than before. So now begins the process of cutting down the foam pieces, which are 0.5 millimeters in thickness, and then sticking them down onto the fans. This should be nice to help dampen the fans as well as tighten up any airflow, and so I think it's a worthwhile process even if it's a bit time consuming. I always say do it right the first time so you don't have to do it again. It's not going to look perfect, but I'm happy with the results, and now we can start to reassemble the laptop and get this going again. I did hit it with one last wipe down and even grabbed some plastic polish just to get it looking as pretty as possible. It's amazing how I was still getting some nasty stuff out of this laptop during the next pass through of cleaning. I guess 10 years is a lot of wear on electronics, especially one that clearly was used a good amount, or at least one that is portable and so probably picked up gunk along the way. So now it's time to put some new thermal compound on, and I just had some MX6 lying around, and so I'll go ahead and use that, and then we can get the fans back in here and the heatsink placed back on so that the cooling is all situated. But I can't forget about the battery that I purchased off Amazon, and so I'll quickly get that in here, and this is a super simple install as well, with just 4 screws that go back into place and the one connector. Now I almost forgot, but we will pretend that I didn't, and I actually put the bottom cover back on, but remember that I was going to add this King Spec M.2 drive that I use for these kinds of projects, which will make installing a bunch of PC games on this much easier since the 120 gigabytes of storage that came with this is a bit annoying to work with given the size of games today. So let's just pretend that I didn't forget, and now that I got the M.2 drive installed, I can put the bottom plate back on, get the screws all back in, and then give it one last polish and wipe down, especially on the inside and just any grooves that I might have missed, and you can see on those wipes that I clearly was still getting more. Okay, that was a doozy of a cleanup, and I'm curious if you enjoy the more in-depth process, or is this just the right amount, or should I go even shorter on that section? Let me know down in the comments since I always do appreciate reading what my viewers think. So it's now time to get a clean install of Windows on here, and yes, I'm opting for Windows since we have an older NVIDIA GPU, and I'd like to get the best possible performance out of the GPU, which is stuck using older drivers on the Linux side. I did opt for Windows 11 LTSC, which is a nice build of Windows made for enterprise that doesn't have all the consumer junk shoehorned into it, but will still allow the laptop to get security updates and all of that. I also prefer doing a clean install since it's a second-hand unit and you just never know. The process went pretty smooth, and you can see just how clean this desktop environment is within Windows 11 LTSC. Now I did need to track down some specific drivers to get the keyboard backlight to work again, and that required downloading the ATK package from the support product page for this model, and yes, kudos to ASUS for still having their support product page up for this 10-year-old laptop, which made tracking down anything missing very simple. I needed some other Intel drivers which were all available on that page as well, and surprisingly none of these were picked up by Snappy Driver Installer, and so I just manually looked at Device Manager and worked my way through the support page and got it all situated. I will just say that I'm pretty impressed by how responsive and peppy the whole experience here is, and honestly, this would be a very nice experience still with web browsing and watching some YouTube, but obviously we're here for the gaming, and so now it's time for the moment that this 10-year-old piece of hardware gets to shine. And of course, I've got a whole bunch of games that I've tested, and we're going to start out with the Cyberpunk 2077 benchmark since I think it's always a good way to demonstrate the capabilities of hardware. And the crazy thing to think about is that this game might feel like it's been out forever, but it actually came out more than 4 years after this laptop release, and so I'm sure this tested the hardware back then and probably convinced a few people to upgrade. I will say that for 10-year-old hardware, this laptop did pretty well with the benchmark, and obviously you're not going to crank the settings up here, but I actually ran the benchmark using low settings with a 1080p resolution, and we were able to stay above 60 frames per second, so it's definitely a game that's playable here. I have a feeling we're going to see a bit of that with the 970M, and I think the Maxwell architecture has aged very well. And I didn't forget, and of course the question that's on everyone's mind is, can it run Doom? Absolutely, but we can go a bit more modern with Doom games, and sadly it won't be Doom the Dark Ages since there is a hard requirement for a GPU that supports ray tracing. So instead I went with Doom Eternal, much like I did with that Razer Blade with the 970M, but unlike that Razer Blade, we do have a bit more of a limitation here since we only have that 3GB of VRAM to work with. And so I have set Doom Eternal to low settings since I can't go higher than that because the game won't allow it. But we're still at a 1080p resolution, and the game does quite well here, staying mostly at 60 frames per second. I had to try out a game that came out around the same time as this laptop, and Ori and the Blind Forest is always a joy to see running on any piece of hardware. But most of all, for a laptop that was considered one of the more powerful ones on the market, this game runs without much issue at a 1080p resolution, which I think is fair to expect out of the top-of-the-line hardware at the time of release. Now for something a bit more demanding, how about some Battlefield 6, which is definitely going to push the system hard, especially when it comes to limited VRAM. But I will say that performance still surprised me despite the limitations of the hardware here, and I have Battlefield 6 set to use the lowest settings possible, and surprisingly we're staying above 30 frames per second using a 1080p resolution and some AMD FSR, which is set to performance to help out as much as possible, but honestly this is not bad at all. So I thought it would just be fun to go all in on this year's releases and check out a selection of games that have come out recently as a way to get a feel for how far we can push the 970M and this 10-year-old ASUS Strix laptop. And I have to say I was pleasantly surprised overall. I know that this necessarily won't be the case for every game that's released in the past year or two, but it's pretty wild to see that if you purchased this Strix laptop when it released, you could still very easily enjoy a lot of the new releases from today, and then factor in just all the games that have come out since 2016, as well as the enormous library of PC games available. I'd say that this hardware combination gave you some serious mileage, and as it's been clearly showing, still has plenty of life left in it. I rounded up a handful of games like the latest entry in one of my favorite racing game series with Forza Horizon 6, and then a bunch of other new releases like 007 First Light, which I'm actually blown away by how well that game did in terms of sales. I think it's obvious that many of us were looking forward to a new 007 game, and then I capped it all off with some LEGO Batman, Legacy of the Dark Knight, Pragmata, and for something a bit different, Screamer, which is a very cool modern take on an old racing game series from back in the day that I actually featured when I took a look at the old Toshiba libretto from the 90s. What's interesting is that for a lot of these newer games, this laptop can still handle a lot of them and essentially becomes a device that targets a 1080p resolution with a 30 frames per second cap. But even for some new releases like LEGO Batman, we can get away with 60 frames per second. But overall, I think that's a fair compromise to play recent releases and still get mileage out of this aging 970M that manages to hold on for another year of play. Without a doubt though, this is still a laptop that would be great for someone's backlog, maybe tackling some older games, and of course checking out some of the wonderful indie games out there. I think it's been a pretty solid showing thus far for the 10-year-old Strix, and so let's check out how it fares with emulation, since I think it's always interesting to examine this area of gaming when we consider what was available in terms of emulation back in 2016. No doubt about it, this laptop will handle many generations of platforms, but I wanted to go a bit further with this, and so I jumped right into some PlayStation 3 emulation, which was certainly a thing back then, but it's safe to say that 10 years later, RPCS3 is in a very different place than it was back in the day. And so it's always interesting to see how the improvements to the emulator can potentially benefit this older hardware. And I was pleasantly surprised by just how well this laptop handled PlayStation 3 emulation using the excellent RPCS3 emulator. I rounded up a few games to test with, including my usuals like Resogun and the very awesome MotorStorm Pacific Rift, which I wish we would get a new entry in this franchise, and then something a bit different with Ninja Theory's Heavenly Sword. And even when it came to heavy shader compilation, which is typical of PlayStation 3 emulation, the laptop handled it quite well, but these games ran well using the PlayStation 3's native resolution, and I think a lot of the library would fare well here. Likewise, I think the same can be said for the PlayStation 3's counterpart during this time, which was the Xbox 360, and using Xenia Canary, I found performance to be pretty decent as well, despite this emulator not being as mature as RPCS 3, and it does seem that it's pushing the hardware much harder than RPCS 3, and so while a game like Forza Horizon seemed to do pretty well, I just think it's neat to see this since Xenia was only capable of launching its first game back in 2015, so it's safe to say that it's seen some improvements since then. But how about something that didn't exist at all back in 2016? And I'm not talking about an emulator. Instead, I'm talking about the entirety of the Nintendo Switch platform, which was not even a thing 10 years ago, and so obviously emulation wasn't available for it since it didn't even exist when this laptop released. But what's been fun for me to see is that now that Switch emulation is very much a thing thanks to something like the Eden emulator, I'm genuinely blown away by how well Switch performs on this 10-year-old piece of hardware. And just with this alone, we've opened up an entire new world of games that didn't exist to owners of this hardware back then. It's pretty wild just how much this old piece of tech can still enjoy the vast library of the Switch. And speaking of not existing back then, how about some PlayStation 4 emulation, which has recently picked up a lot of steam and has seen tremendous improvements. I decided to test a favorite of mine, but a game that's a little bit lighter since it's a remastered game from the Vita, but Gravity Rush Remastered ran incredibly well here, and it's just crazy to me to see this. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact that this is a 10-year-old laptop that I picked up off eBay for just $135, and it's running PlayStation 4 games, or at least the ones that the emulator has compatibility with. So it's time to wrap this all up, and I think it's safe to say that for the price that I paid for the hardware, it's definitely punching above its weight, and will really let you enjoy much of what's out there, with some limitations of course because of that 3GB of VRAM, and just the aging architecture in general that is sadly becoming obsolete for some of the more modern games releasing today. If you purchased one of these when it released and it has survived all of these years, there's no doubt that you got solid value out of your investment. And let me know down in the comments if you're still rocking an ASUS ROG Strix laptop from 2016, or if you're rocking a newer one now. I think this was another fun experiment with capable hardware from back in the day that can still perform, and just like the Razer Blade I looked at from this same time frame, it's clear that hardware from that era could still perform quite well, and shows that gaming can be enjoyed on a budget. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed exploring this laptop with me, and I definitely got more finds with older tech coming up on the channel soon. Until the next time, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.